I want to thank you for having me, and it couldn't be more perfect that we are talking about diversity, equity, and inclusion at an economic summit. I'm going to add to the information around data. I'm going to talk about this concept of neuroscience, and I really want all of us to leave today having a better understanding of the role that we individually can play to build more inclusive cultures and more inclusive communities. But before I begin, I actually want to go back to that bio that was just shared. Every time I hear it, I have to, say to myself, wow, that's me? I did that? Really? That's pretty extraordinary. And the reason why is because when you're going through it and you're doing all of that at work, the experience and the journey feels and looks a lot different. I think that story actually sets the context for what I want to talk to you about today. You see, I call myself the trifecta. I am a young Latina, and I'm about 5'1". So oftentimes, as I was moving up the career ladder, as I was finding myself in positions of power and influence, I also found myself to be one of the only. I found myself in the back of my head thinking that I was not good enough, or that maybe I got into that position out of sheer luck, or even worse, maybe they were guilted into putting me into that role or position. And the higher I climbed in my career, the more power and influence that I cultivated in my journey, the more I felt inadequate, the less I felt like I belonged. I thought that I was the only one experiencing that in my career journey. And then in 2014, the founders of the Latino Leadership Institute came to me with this big, bold vision. And they shared with me some of what I'm going to share with you today. It isn't that meeting that I want to share with you today, though. It's the one that happened right after that. You see, I had grown up in politics. I thought talking about social justice and equity and equality is what everyone did during Sunday dinners. I didn't know better. I thought everyone was worried about the world and how it worked. I thought everyone was thinking about how we need to create this round table where everyone has a seat that looks the same, has the same level of power and influence. I left that meeting, though, with those same feelings of self-doubt. I had no idea why they were looking at me to run the Latino Leadership Institute. What did I know about starting this organization? I crossed the street to go talk to my grandparents, like so many of us do. We have to talk to people and get feedback and advice. And for that, it was my grandparents. And I crossed the street. They happen to live across the street. They also happen to live on the 28th floor of their building. And I promise you that for every floor I went up that day, it felt like there was another level of doubt, another level of concern. Once again, I'm in a career trajectory, and like that elevator on the way up, and I would do anything to just go ahead and hit that bottom floor and just get out of the elevator entirely. But I went in and I shared this vision of the Latino Leadership Institute with my grandfather. And he was just the right person to talk to about all of this work we have to do together. You see, because as a young teenager father, he tried to get a job at a newspaper, and he applied as Lorenzo Martinez. And of course, back in those days, they wouldn't even schedule him for an interview. So being the sneaky, savvy guy that he was, he changed his name to Lawrence Martin to get that interview. And sure enough, he got the interview. He walked in that day. They could obviously tell he was not Lawrence Martin, but they interviewed him anyway. And at the end of the interview, they wanted to give Lorenzo Martinez the job. But Lorenzo said, "Thank you, but no thank you. I have work to do." He decided to spend his entire career working as a union executive. He worked his way up, where he would fight across the globe to ensure that individuals and organizations were creating these cultures of inclusion that we're going to talk about today. But in his career, and in that moment 8 years ago, he reflected and he said, "Mija, we worked really hard and we made advancements, but not nearly enough." And from his perspective, it was this reason. because it wasn't enough for us to convince all the organizations, all the communities, all the economic movers and shakers out there that we deserved a seat at the table. We had to do that and convince ourselves that we belong. So that is the motivation. That's the work I'm in every day, to figure out both sides of that coin. Diversity, equity, and inclusion. How can we rethink it? How can we see it from the systems, the organizations, the challenges, the barriers that exist and persist, and at the same time, spend time focusing in on the individual experiences, emotions, roles, and responsibilities. So today's presentation is the culmination of both of those things. This rethinking diversity, equity, and inclusion, both from a neuroscience lens, how we think and feel, and also from a larger systemic point of view. So let's get started. And if you have a pen and paper, which I see many of you do, I'm going to encourage you to have that readily available, because I'm going to ask you throughout today's presentation to do some self-reflection and thinking. And I'm going to open up today's talk with this question. How long do you believe we have been a free society here in the United States of America? So real quickly, come up with an answer in your head. Now, I would bet in this room that I had a variety of answers popping up in one's head. Maybe some of you that are sitting in the room today were in that camp that, well, we're America, we're the land of the free. We have forever been a free society. It's what we were built on. We have the Statue of Liberty. Maybe there were those of you in the room that were like, I don't know the date, but I'm going to guess that we became free when we ended and abolished slavery, talking about over 240 years ago. Maybe some of you in the room were like, well, we became free when we stopped the, behaviors and practices of segregation. And between slavery and the Civil Rights Act, we actually had nearly 100 years as a segregated society. Maybe some of you history buffs in the room, legal minds, politicos, thought back to the Civil Rights Movement and said, well, we became a free society when we put laws on the books to ensure it, to require it. And maybe still there are some of you in the room today that said, what is this crazy lady talking about? We are far from a free society. I bring this up to set the context of any conversation, not just this one, around diversity, equity, and inclusion, for two key points and takeaways. Number one, we haven't been at this that long. Most people, when they think about diversity, equity, and inclusion, there's this large assumption that we've always been on this path to be an inclusive society. When the reality is there's some of you in today's room maybe that have been alive longer than we've had laws on our books that require things like inclusion and equity. Point number one, we're kind of new, maybe in our adolescence phase of DE&I work as a country, and we have a long way to go. The second point is that when we talk about DE&I, when people ask me, what's the hardest thing about DE&I? Why is this thing so tricky? In my opinion, it's because we look at DE&I not through what logically makes sense, what we're told, what we really want aspirationally. We look at DE&I through our own lived experiences, lenses, biases, feelings, and thoughts. If you grew up in America where you were in a predominantly white community that was affluent and privileged and educated, and you didn't have to worry about basic rights, then you're probably going to be over here thinking that we are a free society. Stop questioning it. Why do you want to pull us down? But if you live over here in a marginalized community where every day there were barriers, systemic racism, biasm, struggles, maybe you're in that camp that's like, what are you talking about? Freedom, that's a concept, not a reality. So when we talk about DE&I, we got to understand we're relatively new to the game. And the hardest thing about DE&I is that it's not something that you can define and explain that fits for everyone, because we all bring our individual experiences to it. Which is why in just a little bit, I'm going to talk to you about that neuroscience piece, because that's why it's critically important. Before I get going on that piece though, I always like to start with the why, because any of us that are in the work of DE&I, we know how hard it is. We know we leave frustrated most days, and that the wins never seem big enough. So I always have to say, let's build a foundation, not of quicksand, but strong cement. Let's cement the reason that we're doing this in the first place. And I'm going to share that through this demographic destiny story. So we know point number one of why this work matters is because we're living in a country that is rapidly becoming more diverse by the day. If you look back to when we passed the Civil Rights Act in the 1960s, we were still about 85% majority identifying as white, meaning that less than 15% of the population at the time of civil rights movement of Martin Luther King and Cesar Chavez, that we were still a predominantly white nation. But as we move forward and fast forward to, let's say, 2020, our most recent census, you can see that we're now in this kind of 60-40 split, meaning that about 60% of the United States today is identifying as white, and about 40% is identifying as Black, Latino, Asian, Indigenous, BIPOC, people of color, right? And when we fast forward even more into the future, and let's say 2050, that is that turning point for the country where we, from that moment, will forever be a minority majority nation, meaning that there will be more people in our country who identify as something other than white. Now, for many of you leaders in the room today, you may represent communities that have already passed that threshold. We can look at whole states like California and others as examples of what the fabric of the nation will actually look like in the years to come. So one of our motivating factors to really building these communities of inclusion is because the country is going to require it of us, just from a demographic population standpoint. But also, the second motivation is that demography alone does not determine destiny. So for 60 years, we have had practices, policies, principles, and you'll see that in just a minute, on the books to ensure that leadership is inclusive and reflective. There are goals that go back to the late 1980s of largely corporate America that said that diversity, equity, and inclusion is a key pillar. There isn't a website today, I would be surprised, that doesn't have this as one of the core values of the organization. But yet today, all these years later, after the civil rights movement, still nearly 70% of all leadership in corporate America today identify as white men. In fact, recently we put out a report, a survey study that actually showed that since 2000, over the last 20 years, that over 90% of new CEO placements was actually still identifying as white. So despite our goals, despite the fact that the country is changing, leadership opportunity gaps are actually widening, because as the diversity grows, we're not growing that reflective leadership. In fact, when companies come to me and they'll say, well, help us build this, but we're starting off really good. Our diversity numbers look really great for the organization. We're really proud of them. And let me not take away any progress or commitment that's being made. It matters. But I always ask them, do you mind if we dig a little bit deeper? And this is true for corporate America, but I can tell you folks, whether I'm working with governments, nonprofits, education, universities, it doesn't matter. The data usually bears out the same, regardless of what sector or industry I'm working with. And that is, when I dig into the data, the actual data, what we find is that diversity does exist within the companies or organizations. But oftentimes it's captured only at the entry level or managerial level. By the time we get to leadership positions, which I define as director and above, you can see that both gender inequality and racial ethnic inequality continues to persist. In fact, as we get into those senior vice president and C-level positions, we're nearly invisible, especially if you're the trifecta like me, where you are a young Latina. So it made sense to me as I started digging into data and really exploring what was going on, that some of those very emotions that I felt going through my career journey weren't in isolation. It wasn't a Joelle problem. It was something that we were facing in our organizations today. In fact, when we look at board service, another position where we are entirely missing, and when I'm talking about board service, well, the data in front of you has to do with corporate boards. We've done our work. We can tell you what those local appointed, those really powerful, boards of commissions and, local economic boards and committees, we are still invisible there too. And if we just looked at it for a moment through a gender lens, saying, well, maybe it's just we're not doing a good enough job with the BIPOC community. The reality is that in 2018, less than 15% of all board seats in publicly traded companies located here in Colorado were actually held by a woman at all, regardless of race or ethnicity. How severe of a problem is this? Well, let's look at it this way, because if there's any fact that's going to prove that we can't just let demography guide us in this journey, that we're going to have to dig in deep and do things differently, it's this data point, at least for me. Because over 51% of the population today are women. And yet, if your name is John or David, which respectfully is 2% of the entire United States population, you have a better chance of serving on a board and being in leadership in America today, if your name is John and David, than if you are a woman. So that leads me to the second question. I'd like you to take a moment and just think about why, in your mind, through your experience, has DE&I efforts failed to create lasting change as it relates to ensuring that leadership is reflective of changing demographics? Why haven't we been able to close some of these opportunity gaps? I want to give you my thinking, my thoughts, the research. You see, because for us, I can never see where I'm headed unless I have a better, deeper understanding of where we've been. And I had the benefit, remember, of growing up in a household where I thought these conversations were just normal, everyday conversations. But let's take a moment to explore the history of DE&I so that we can better predict the future of it, better build the future of it. What you may not know is a lot of the work, language, strategies, all of the intentions that we have around DE&I were actually developed in a framework in 1961. Then President JFK called on his Vice President, LBJ, to oversee a committee. The task of this committee was to prepare for pending litigation. They knew that corporate America, government contractors, and others were likely going to be the subject of many discrimination lawsuits as the laws of the civil rights movement began to take effect. Organizations were not prepared prior to that to ensure that they had practices in place to avoid those kind of lawsuits. So he formed this committee. And the committee's ultimate task was to create the framework rules of engagements around DE&I. It wasn't called DE&I then. And what happened out of that is this committee, shown here, obviously lacking much of the diversity that would need to be at the table to create a good, solid framework, they ended up coming up with what is called the Plans for Progress. You can actually walk into the Kennedy Library today and physically read the Plans for Progress. It became that draft rules of engagement became Executive Order 10925. You all probably know what 10925 is because it's probably had some level of role in all of your work since you started your career. Because what they created out of the Plans for Progress is something called the EEOC, the Equal Employment Opportunity. And what the Equal Employment Opportunity was all about was they had to put language to this work around DE&I. They had to create goals and objectives and rules of engagement. What most people don't know is that we haven't, since 1961, made many changes to that rules of engagement. Many of the practices, policies, ideas, and frameworks that we are trying to apply today in 2022 to try to change outcomes were drafted by this small group of non-diverse individuals in 1961. So let's take a look really quickly at that history of what that looks like for many of us and how we've experienced it in our DE&I journeys individually and collectively. So in the 1960s, we had the civil rights movement. We had terms and ideas that came out of the Plans for Progress, like affirmative action. And of course, ultimately, we have a product now for DE&I called Equal Employment Opportunity. But it's really important because all of those concepts and ideas and strategies and frameworks were based on the assumption that everyone who was part of the minority community, the marginalized community, the other communities would take part in assimilation. Meaning at that time, the framework was built on an assumption that we were a great melting pot, which meant that we would all be thrown in, but our individual uniqueness would blend away as we became one United States of America. Well, it was clear that that melting pot assumption was inherently wrong on so many levels because people were not willing or wanting to give up their individual identity. People push back on this idea of like the great melting pot just stir us all together and we all lose our consistency to this notion of a salad bowl, meaning you can blend us all together, but we're all going to retain our individual uniqueness. I should not have to give up who I am to be part of your salad, right? So now we have a new language. Now we have a new framework. Now we have new strategies that are building on, and they're called things like diversity. So now in the 1980s, 1990s, many organizations started creating employee resource groups. They started having diversity councils. Many of them started putting diversity goals in their actual annual strategies. Many organizations, for the first time ever, hired diversity employees, meaning that they were the head of diversity for the organization. And then that really bled into the next framework that we used around DE&I, and that was, how do you manage for diversity? How do you create, going from diversity, this idea, this feeling, this emotion of inclusion? And people really began focusing in now on sort of process, performance, and outcomes, right? Key performance indicators around DE&I. And this is where the science of inclusion comes into play. And I'm going to unwrap that for you here in just a minute. But before I do, I just want to make sure that when I throw out these terms, DEI, diversity, equity, and inclusion, that I'm clear as to how I'm defining it. Because again, we all come to DE&I with our own perspectives, lens, and visions about it. Oftentimes when people are talking about diversity, they say, well, it's what you see. It's the things you can count: race, ethnicity, gender, age, et cetera, et cetera. I don't disagree with that. I just want to add to it. It's what you see plus a lot of what you don't. You see, diversity is about the many layers of one's identity. There are internal elements of that identity, things I've inherited, like my ethnicity, my height, my gender, eye color, stuff like that. There's things that I have chosen for myself around my identity, right? I choose to identify as a Latina. Some in my community may identify as Chicana or Latinx. So there's these other components of it. There's intersectionality, like our education and socioeconomic status, even things such as the privilege that we hold. So when we're talking about diversity, we're talking about all of the layers of uniqueness, richness that individuals bring to the table. When we talk about equity, we are not talking about equality. You see, equity is an action. It's what we have to do. It's an investment. It's a strategy. See, equity and equality are often getting used interchangeably, and they shouldn't be. Because in a world where equality is the way of the game, everyone would just get the same. But in DE&I, giving everyone the same is not going to address the disproportionate barriers that some may hold. So we have to go a step further and apply equity, invest in equity. Equity, like Aristotle said, is that proportional investment that we have to make to close any gaps, to remove any barriers. If you had $10,000 to give to nonprofits, you're not going to give 10 $1,000 grants out. That's equality. Instead, you're more likely to make to do your work, to understand the need, to understand the outcomes, to understand the inputs, and you're going to make investment based on need allocation. That's equity. And that's what's required in this work. When we talk about inclusion at the LLI, we're not talking about a thing. It's not a thing. Inclusion and belonging aren't a thing. Inclusion and belonging is a feeling. It's an experience. It's a realization. When you get inclusion, when that comes to full fruition, it's when individuals can bring their full uniqueness, all that beautiful diversity to the table, where an organization has invested in creating opportunities, closing gaps, and it's where uniqueness and belonging can come together. And it creates this feeling that I can be myself and still belong. That's DE&I. So how do we bring the neuroscience piece to the table? And what is this neuroscience thing to begin with? Let me show you how this all comes together. How old do you think you were when you began to form stereotypes in your mind? Again, if you have paper, jot this down. Again, we probably had a variety of answers. Those of you that are thinking, well, probably from birth, maybe those of you that think in adulthood, and maybe something somewhere in between. The answer is also the answer to the roots of something we call bias. You see, when we are young children, in fact, when we are really young children, between the ages of 3 and 5, our brain is preconditioned, pre-programmed to begin to categorize people. And we categorize people at this young age by things like race, ethnicity, gender, height, right? All of these things are programmed in. They're programmed, though, the coding for that programming is coming from our external world, our parents, our teachers, the books that we're reading, the shows that we're watching, the news that's in the background, how grandma talks about other folks. What we don't realize as adults is that we don't operate consciously thinking day in and day out. In fact, when we look at our brain, this brain, there's 3 parts of the brain. There's this part down here, our cerebellum and our brainstem, and that's called our reptilian brain. That's where breathing and balance and eyesight and things we don't think about, that's all happening unconsciously, take place. And that center part of our brain, though, is something called the limbic system. And in the limbic system lives things like the amygdala, hypothalamus. But it is in that limbic system that learning, emotions, memory are solidified. Right here on the front of our head and through the neocortex lives our prefrontal cortex. Our prefrontal cortex is the one part of our brain that's actually online or conscious, logical, rational. So we can make good judgments and decisions based on DE&I in our prefrontal cortex. But the reality is that we do not operate around DE&I practices, thinking, and strategy using our prefrontal cortex. I love it if we did, but we don't. We leverage our limbic system when it comes to DE&I. And the reason why is quite simple. Because when we're talking about implicit bias, when we're talking about the limbic system, we are talking about these pre-reflective attributes and attitudes we have towards people without conscious knowledge. And the reason that I know, going back to when did we become a free society question, we all had different answers, is this very thing. Our brain is way undersized for the amount of information that we provide it in a given day. Our brain's function is to keep us alive. In order to do that, it has 6 major activities that it is responsible for. 6 things we know that the brain does. First of all, the brain is a connection machine. You see, this prefrontal cortex is way undersized. Every thought, every decision, every strategy, it would exhaust our energy and zap us if we actually leverage our prefrontal cortex. So what the brain has done since it started growing is it begins to make connections. And when those connections get made at the very young age of 3 or 5 is when they begin to form around this notion of bias and inclusion and diversity. If we continue to perpetuate that thinking, if messages are solidified, if they are reinforced, if we never get outside of that diversity zone of which we grew up in, then we can assume that that memory, connection, emotion, and feeling is pretty hardwired. We also know that no 2 brains are alike. I mean, going back to what I said around freedom is that you can't have my brain because you haven't lived my life. I see the world through my lived experiences, not through yours. I don't see it as it is. I see it as I think it is. So do you. Makes it hard for us to find common ground around some really complicated issues. Since the brain hardwires everything it can, it leaves very little up to that logical, conscious part of our brain. In fact, over 80%, 85% of our decision-making and thinking is done unconsciously. Over 80% of all of our decisions are based on emotion alone. And there is nothing more emotional to many people than talking about the topics of diversity, equity, and inclusion. That hardwiring that we have in our brain drives our automatic perceptions, implicit biases, stereotypes, the way we see the world. Not the way we see it today as a professional, as a community leader, as an economic change maker, but as we see it as our 3, 5, 6, 7, 8-year-old self. That's when our thinking about others was really hardwired. And the sad reality is that it's practically impossible to deconstruct that mental wiring. Listen, if you grew up in a time, right, where Blacks and Latinos were not considered equal, and that was your thinking, it is going to take a lot to override that. And you know it's true because we all have those moments. I'm an open book, I share it all the time, right? For me, it's this fear that I have. You know, I grew up with privilege. I always had a home. You know, I wasn't surrounded by the unhoused when growing up. So it doesn't matter. I could be in an open, safe space with lots of people around, but my perception, my bias, my stereotyping, the moment that I see someone who's experiencing being unhoused, I'll hold my bag tighter. I'll walk further around them just to avoid them. I have this unimaginable fear, even though I know the data, I know the logic that I shouldn't be, there's no reason necessarily to be afraid statistically. But because I didn't grow up with that in my diversity zone, I have and hold these biases. And even though I've told myself over and over to stop thinking that way, it's impossible. It's a natural, instinctual way. So here's why neuroscience is everything for me in DE&I. Because we know how to rewire the brain. I can't take away all of those things that you've been taught and reinforced throughout your life. All we can do is starting today is create new wiring, new thinking, leverage new neuroscience-based strategies to help us think about this differently. And the way that we know we can affect that is by affecting the science of bias at its roots. Our brain has one processing function. It's not logic, illogical. It's not conscious, unconscious. It is the great alarm system. You may recall in elementary science class, fight or flight, where you learned, like, you either fight or flight in situations of fear, right? You run away from something or you go towards something. Well, that's because that's how the brain is functioned to process the world around it. Think of it as the great fire alarm in your brain. Any sense of danger, any sense of threat, any sense of difference in our brain, that limbic system goes into overload, and we automatically go towards disengaging, moving away, because we are wired to think that difference is threatening. Change, threatening. We don't like it. And so that's why we even fall out of habits when we're trying to get into a new habit. It's really hard to kick bad habits because any level of change is a threat. Just saying the words diversity, equity, and inclusion could be a major threat for people, right? They're afraid they're going to say something wrong. They're afraid they're going to be labeled a racist. They're afraid that they're going to be seen and othered. They're afraid that they're going to be cast out aside as the world becomes more demographically diverse. So what we have to do in neuroscience around DE&I is to figure out how we can diminish threat levels when it comes to things that can be so threatening, and instead help the brain see things as a good thing, as a reward. How do we keep people motivated and engaged, right? That is the science of bias. That is the trick. That is figuring it out. That is the game-changing work that we've been engaged with. So that begs one to question, if we are wired to be so alarmed by things that are different, how do you think individuals begin to create these meaningful connections with other people, especially people that are very different than them, especially people that live outside their diversity comfort zones? Here's the trick. Here's the journey. Here's where the neuroscience, the contextual history, the personal and lived experience all come together. Insight to inclusive leadership and the SEAT model. You see, because for so long, when organizations, communities, economic councils, you name it, began to say DE&I is our pillar, they would come to folks like me and others working and living in this space, and they'd say, can you help me write a strategic plan for DE&I? And can you tell me what the ROI is going to be? And I'd look at them and I'd be like, what? You're speaking a foreign language to me right now, actually. I don't understand what you're asking me to do. Because see, most people approach things, especially DE&I efforts, as a plan, a strategy, a KPI, and all of that is true, but they miss all the important parts of the journey. You see, it goes back to what I've been saying, that this is a personal experience. This is not solved systemically, organizationally, high level. The president doesn't send an executive order. There's no magic wand to make us all DE&I experts. There's no magic, easy way to create inclusive cultures. If so, they would have been done already. Let's be honest, friends. We face many headwinds in this work. Not everyone wants it. Some people think that they know the way to get there. Some people just want to have some baseline numbers to sell to their shareholders. And then there's all of us who are willing to have conversations like this, who really want to lean into this work and figure it out. So this is how I'm encouraging all of you to think about it from this time forward. Stop thinking about the outcomes first. They may guide you, they may motivate you, they may be your true north, but you have to begin at the roots of the problem. You have to understand your individual and collective ambition around DE&I, not for the outcomes, but for the journey you're willing to take on it. What are the motivating factors? How are you going to stay on this journey when things get really rough, because they will? After we can solidify, instead of building this in quicksand, and actually lay the foundation deeply in the roots, the next thing we have to deal with, honestly, and have honest conversations around, are the emotions and attitudes that are constantly surrounding DE&I work. I don't think that there's enough honest conversation taking place today about the pain, frustration, fear, anxiety, hope, concern. You see, remember, our limbic system, especially in times of high stress, and especially when we are hyperactive and around things that make us uncomfortable, we cut off access to the prefrontal cortex, that logical reasoning part of our brain, the one we need to cultivate that strategy, the one we need for execution of that strategy. So my point is, you actually can't have the strategy, you can't execute strategy, unless we've done the hard work of understanding where that limbic system is going to override it, derail it, and then sometimes just bomb it and destroy it altogether. So we have to spend better time on the front end addressing all of the emotions in the room. When we can do that and have honest conversations around that, we can build the tactics, we can build the strategies, we can give you tools and abilities to be able to put into your toolbox to overcome these unconscious implicit biases that are truly running the show around DE&I. And then, putting it all together, we can get to a place of action. And then we can have a strategic plan. And then we can build in KPIs. What's been happening over the course of the last 60 years is that most of our DE&I framework coming out of that Plans for Progress was built on a notion of compliance. We need people to comply around DE&I. We need you to get on board around DE&I. We need you to follow the rules so we don't get sued around DE&I. I would argue all the questions I've asked come down to that. Compliance alone is not going to change outcomes. We've tried it for 60 plus years. We have to invite people to this work. We have to do all of the work that's required in order to get to the outcomes, to reach the goals, to change the face of leadership and create cultures of inclusion and belonging. And the ROIs are clear. I would be remiss speaking before an economic council, talking about economic prosperity, if I didn't make it crystal clear. When I shared that demographic destiny early on, what I didn't share is that the largest growing population of the minority population in the United States are Latinos. Today, we represent about 20% of the United States. If you fast forward to 2050, 2060, even and beyond, we become well over a third of the population here in the United States. We partnered with researchers many years ago to quantify, to understand the economic impact of this growing Latino community. And did you know that when calculated, the Latino GDP in the United States of America is the 8th largest GDP in the world? And when we look at how fast the Latino GDP is growing, we find that it is the 3rd fastest growing GDP in the world, only behind China and India. When we look at workforce replacement, in a 5-year period between 2010 and 2015, Latinos represented 70% of the workforce replacement in the country. How do I know that statistically as fact? Because during that 5-year period, well, we added nearly 2.5 Latinos to the workforce. We actually saw a net loss of almost 2,500 white workers in the workforce. As the boomer population retires, that again, because of demographics, tended to identify as white Americans, are quickly replaced with communities, BIPOC community members, you can see how the workforce of tomorrow is going to look much different than it does today. When we talk about DE&I and the ROI of DE&I, I make one final point. All of these stats, McKinsey, all the data around what it does for, market reach, what it does for productivity, what it does for your increased revenues. But let me simply put it this way. The economic vitality of the United States will depend largely on what we do to make sure that we have an inclusive economy. You build inclusive economies by having reflective, inclusive leadership. And we really, once and for all, close the huge opportunity and wealth gaps in our country. It's no longer a nice to have. It's no longer tucked under social justice. This is economic vitality. So how do we build it at the LLI? We built a simple model called the seat model. We want to open seats at the table for folks. And in order to do that at the individual level, our role and responsibility is to engage in greater self-awareness, exploration of our own biases, an understanding of our own emotions, the lenses of which we work, the perceptions, the hardwiring that we bring to this work. Only then can we begin to create new self-awareness, new opportunities of thinking. The E is you can't do DE&I work without empathy. And you can't build empathy if you're not operating regularly outside of your diversity comfort zones, meaning that you are actively engaging and talking to folks that are different, that you haven't had a lot of experience with. You are curious, you are open. When we build empathy, we build things like trust, understanding. You can't have a culture of inclusion without empathy. And we stay siloed, we stay separated. We think that we're doing this again out of our prefrontal cortex logical mode, but we're not, based on our limbic system. Third, we have to stay active in this work. There's no attend a course, listen to me speak, and we've got this solved. We've seen the data so far today. So you have to be committed to showing up, doing the work. You're gonna fail. You're gonna make mistakes on this DE&I journey, but continue down that journey. Stay active, stay committed. And finally is the T. You can't have DE&I without a foundation built on trust. And when I talk about trust, I'm talking about trusting yourself. Trusting in the work, trusting in the team around you, trusting in the process. But here's the other thing. Having people trust that you are authentically part of this journey as a leader, as an ally, as an advocate. See, people are really good these days understanding who is in that surface space of DE&I and who is truly committed. When you have successfully cultivated trust, you are on the journey to becoming a more inclusive leader. At the LLI, we built this program for everything we've talked about today, starting on this journey with a better exploration and understanding of diversity. Diversity in and of itself is complex with many layers. We also have to really understand what equity looks like. I said it was an action. It's what we have to do. It's an investment. But sometimes we forget the other side of that coin, the micro inequities that take place, like microaggressions in the workplace and stereotypes. So it's not just the big equity factors, it's the small micro inequities that we have to solve day to day. Then we have to spend a lot more time on this bias that I'm talking about. Things like confirmation bias, things like the halo horn effects that we don't recognize or know are actually helping us function as we relate to other people, particularly people that are different than us. And then through our partnership with the University of Colorado and Dr. Stephanie Johnson, we actually have an inclusifier matrix. So individuals and organizations can actually get a report about their strengths and follies as a great inclusifier. How are you creating organizations of uniqueness and belonging? And all of this is for naught if we don't also talk about how we continue to leverage what we know about the brain and neuroscience to create lasting change. It's like New Year's resolutions. Don't we start off so good in January? And I think the average date is around February 15th that most of them fail. To change, especially to change in something as difficult and as deeply rooted as something like DE&I, is going to require the neuroscience components to teach us how to create new thinking and then leading to new behavior. So I'm just going to close with this final thing, tying it all together. I think often about my grandfather and that conversation that I had with him that day about, it's got to be more than just helping organizations and individuals figure out what's at stake and what work we need to do. It really does come down to individuals. And for so long, DE&I work has focused in on the systems and the organizations and with the bearing of most of the responsibility on their shoulders. But the reality is it's on all of our shoulders. If we're going to change outcomes, create more inclusive economies, a more inclusive culture, we're going to do so by doing the work ourselves. Because the change does not happen externally. It really does start from within. So I want to thank you for the time you've given me. I don't know if we're doing Q&A. I know I have about 10 minutes, but I sincerely want to thank you for the time and attention you've given this topic today.
Well, thank you so much. When we initially were thinking about inviting you, and it was, we were kind of debating how wonderful it would be to have you in here in person, but there is about a foot of snow outside, and so it probably worked out best this way, because we still got to have you here. So thank you so much for joining us. You've given us a lot to think about, to reflect on for our community, and I think that creates a lot of positive conversation in a lot of ways. So thank you, Joelle. We will be sharing your slides with folks and contact information and all of that. So see you later, and we'll see you down the road.
Yeah, thank you. Stay warm, be safe.
Cool. All right. That was good. Okay.